Hello, I'm Ryan. Welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, I'm ranking the James Bond film actors. This is a request that I've received from a number of you, and now that I've finished my journey through the Eon Productions Bond films, as well as the quote-unquote unofficial Bond film, Never Say Never Again, it feels like a good time to do this video. It can work as an end cap to my series on the Bond films and summarize my feelings about the versions of Bond that we've seen in the cinema to date. This will further clarify my own subjective leanings toward the Bond characters, what aspects of the Bond character I value more than others, and hopefully provide some context about my feelings on the series as a whole. If you've been following my channel long enough, you already know who my favorite Bond is. In fact, if you scroll through the thumbnails on my channel, it's pretty obvious who my favorite Bond is. So that's where we're actually going to start this video. We're going to get that right out of the way, and then we're going to work up to my least favorite Bond, which I don't think I've ever expressed on this channel. And that should provide a little bit of intrigue. There are definitely going to be some surprises along the way. I'm sure some of you are going to roll your eyes at my ranking, but my ranking is my own and I stand by it. This is not a stunt. So let's start at the very beginning. It's the only place to start, and that is with my favorite James Bond, Timothy Dalton. Timothy Dalton is kind of a oddball pick these days. Certainly people have come around to Dalton's Bond, especially in the wake of Daniel Craig's era, but not many people put him in the #1 slot. I have connected with Dalton's Bond since my high school years. That was in the middle of the Brosnan era. I really started to connect with Dalton's Bond at that time when Die Another Day had come out, and the series was feeling at a weird juncture, and Dalton's Bond really presented the antithesis in some ways of what Die Another Day was doing. Bond as a genuine working professional in a cloak and dagger industry. Dalton's Bond is world weary. He's a veteran. He knows what he's doing. He does it well. He's not this sort of glamorized, hyper exaggerated icon of the screen. He feels grounded. He feels like a character that could be in an even more realistic spy thriller than his Bond films. His Bond films are still colorful. They're still very much connected to the spirit of pulp adventure, but Bond in them very much feels like a fairly realistic character, even when he's asked to do some fairly unrealistic things. He feels like a very intelligent, seasoned secret agent. And I really love that. Timothy Dalton has a gift for bringing out Bond's intelligent side. Of course, he was given the material to do so. The 2 films that he did put Bond in the position of really getting to flex his intelligence. Not all of the Bond actors got the same level of opportunity to do this. The Living Daylights is structured very much as an investigation where Dalton's Bond is able to navigate different lanes of inquiry and stage scenarios to try to flush out some level of clarity in the midst of an ongoing conspiracy. And License to Kill has him destroying a villain's organization from the inside out, pitting people against each other. It's a very intelligent way to structure Bond stories, and Dalton's Bond really leans into that. In fact, Dalton is gifted as an actor at doing something that I really love in Fleming's Bond. In fact, I love Fleming's Bond more than I love the cinematic Bond on the whole. I know that's a controversial take. Many of us come to love Bond through the movies, not through the books, and that was my journey as well. But if you put a gun to my head and said I had to choose between the Ian Fleming novels and the movies, I would probably save the books. It's the books that really have my heart, and you can kind of see that continuity with Dalton here, because Dalton is very much the closest the movies have ever come to giving us the Fleming Bond character. Dalton captures that aspect of Fleming that is Bond's interior monologue. He doesn't do it literally. We're not getting voiceovers in Dalton's movies. But Bond being a very internalized character, you need an actor who is able to communicate what Bond is thinking and feeling very subtly. And the great Bond actors all can do this to one degree or another, but I feel like Dalton is especially good at conveying what Bond is feeling in the room he's in at any given moment. That you can kind of follow Bond's train of thought and sort of enter into his psychological space a little bit. And I really appreciate that with Dalton's Bond. I really appreciate the level of emphasis and satisfaction that brings to the moments in those movies where Bond is outsmarting the villain. That's something that I think is underrated as one of the key cornerstones of any Bond adventure, that Bond should really be able to outsmart his foes through some bit of cleverness. Too often the movies just lean on blind luck and happenstance, and it's really satisfying when it's actually the result of Bond being very intelligent, and those moments are greatly magnified when Dalton is in the driver's seat. Dalton is not the most stylish and glamorous Bond. He is not the full movie star Bond the way that some of these others really seem to be. Again, he is a little bit more subdued. I actually despise his wardrobe and styling in License to Kill. It's okay in The Living Daylights, but I appreciate it too because it just goes back to that working professional ethos. Bond in the books is not a particularly hyper glamorous individual. He's very particular, but he's not necessarily a fashion magazine icon. And I can respect that about Dalton's Bond as well. Dalton's Bond feels very purposeful and has a distinct identity, but is not necessarily a clothes horse. And I respect the coherence of his overall interpretation in that way. Everything about Dalton's Bond just seems to really sit nicely together to create this very coherent portrait of who Bond is, this sort of ruthless seasoned professional who also has a softer side. And it gives a nice level of contrast and complexity to a very iconic character. Now, prepare for whiplash. My second favorite Bond is Roger Moore. I guess you can say I like extremes. I like Bond at his most grounded, and I like Bond at his most outlandish. I like the gritty Bond, and I like the Bond who went to outer space. Roger Moore's Bond is very much Bond at his most exaggerated. It pushes the Bond phenomenon to the breaking point. Roger Moore's Bond movies have things like double-taking pigeons and hovercraft gondolas. But there is a through line here. Roger Moore's Bond has a through line of intelligence. Roger Moore projects intelligence, he projects wit, he projects cleverness. It's an impish cleverness, it's a boyish cleverness, it's sometimes a juvenile cleverness. But Roger Moore's Bond is often positioned as the smartest guy in the room, and his Bond is continually getting one over on the villains through wit, whether that's just a clever put down or some bit of clever maneuvering in a particular scenario. In my Octopussy review, I talked about how much I think that film really magnifies that aspect of Roger Moore's Bond. One of the great scenes in that movie is when he's playing backgammon with Kamal Khan, and the way he maneuvers that scenario to kind of use Kamal Khan's cheating against him, and the smug satisfaction Roger Moore's Bond shows when he has gotten one over on Khan is so delicious. It's the same thing that happens in that movie when Roger Moore is leaning into the aspects of Bond rigging the auction. He's being a little reckless. He's pushing things to the limit. If things go bad, Bond is going to be in a tough spot and have a lot to answer for if that auction scenario goes bad. But he knows how to push the villain's buttons by just continuing to bid. That kind of thing is so satisfying to me. Roger Moore has that sort of effortless coolness that comes in moments like that. moments of just total assuredness. It's coupled with Roger Moore's natural gift for entertainment. If Dalton is the most actorly Bond, the Bond who just feels so well performed, so intentionally performed, every moment very thoughtfully calibrated, Roger Moore's Bond always feels very calibrated towards entertainment. There is never a moment that Roger Moore is on screen where it doesn't seem like he is giving 110%. He is always out there to be entertaining the audience. And I can't watch enough of him, to be honest. My eyes are always glued to him whenever he's on the screen. His facial expressions are so dynamic, so joyful. There is a supercut you could make of just Roger Moore reaction shots, and they are all phenomenal. And for that reason, just the joy of watching Roger Moore, he is my number 2. And that puts in the number 3 spot Sean Connery. Sean Connery is generally held to be the greatest James Bond. That's the default answer. And from an influence perspective, it's certainly not wrong. He originated the character. He took the character from a character in the Ian Fleming novels to the great icon we know today. But I've grown a little bit distanced from Sean Connery's portrayal of the character over the years, and revisiting the Connery films in this YouTube series has certainly clarified my thoughts about why that is. And it's mainly because Sean Connery's Bond is so ruthless to the extent that we lose a bit of the other aspects of his character. He's not unintelligent, but he's not especially clever. In a lot of his movies, he's just kind of ambling through the story. And he has some of the best one-liners in the series. He can be very funny, he can be very mean, he can be very savage, but you don't get a lot of the wonderful dynamic range that you get actually in Dalton and Roger Moore's Bond. Roger Moore and Dalton are both kind of mirror images of each other. Dalton's Bond is the ruthless Bond who can sometimes be soft and warm, and Roger Moore's Bond is often the Bond who can be warm and then occasionally very ruthless. Connery's Bond stays more within a consistent lane. There's not a huge range of expression for Connery's Bond. That's not to say he's not well acted. Connery is a brilliant actor, but there is a sense in which his character as Bond is more narrowly defined. There's a very clear archetype for how his character is going to behave, established from the outset. You can see the equalizer sliders slightly adjusting with his Bond performances over the course of his core initial 5-film run. But you're not getting a ton of variety from Sean Connery's Bond. And I think despite his natural star power, his ability to deliver one-liners effortlessly, his ability to just frankly look so glamorous, the way he just owns the screen is perhaps the greatest of any of the Bonds. I just don't find as much to fascinate me in his portrayal of Bond as I return to it. I don't fixate it on the same way that I do the performances of Dalton and Moore. And that's why he sits comfortably in the 3rd spot. So in the 4th spot, this is where things start to get a little interesting. I am going to put Daniel Craig. Craig is the most psychopathic of the Bonds. He is the true brute force killer of the Bonds. Dalton is a seasoned professional, but you don't get the sense that he is just like a true, like, lethal machine the way Daniel Craig's Bond is. Craig's Bond is a scary fellow. He is just tearing his way through the world. And that was a reaction in some ways to the more gentlemanly Bond of the Brosnan years. When Daniel Craig came out, they had him break through a wall to communicate that this guy was a brute force agent and he was going to go after whoever was in his sights with the most lethal intensity. But I miss things in the Daniel Craig era. I like that harder edged. I like Bond kind of becoming this darker character. That's fine. It's certainly a little bit of a departure from prior Bonds to push it to that extent, but every Bond pushes one aspect or another into a different extreme, and I can appreciate the variety of that. But where I get a little hung up with Daniel Craig is that it loses the aspects of Bond that I so much enjoy. Bond's preoccupation with the finer things in life, his attention to his particular interests. Daniel Craig's Bond is designed in such a way that the Bond persona is almost something he puts on the way Batman puts on his bat suit. It's like there's a recurring motif in the Daniel Craig films I've talked about where he puts on his tuxedo almost like the batsuit. It's like that's how he becomes Bond. But like whenever there's a moment of crisis, personal crisis for him, he just kind of drops all that at the drop of a hat. Whenever Bond has quit, so to speak, the service, the way the movies suggest that in the Daniel Craig era is he's like always in a t-shirt and things like that. He goes back to this very casual identity, and with that is a sense that the lust for life that powers the other Bonds is a little bit dimmed with Daniel Craig, and I miss that in his portrayal. That's not to say it's gone altogether. I think he is the most fashion forward of any of the Bonds, and I think if Connery established Bond style, Daniel Craig is the first Bond to take the role on and really try to lean into that. And in a way that substitutes for the way the films don't quite lean into the lifestyle aspects as much. We don't really get, outside of Bond preparing his iconic, Vesper Martini recipe in Casino Royale, you don't really get Daniel Craig's Bond like lecturing on the proper temperature for champagne or things like that you do with some of the other Bonds. But you do get this sense that he is a really big fashion guy. And I appreciate that because I think some of his outfits are some of the very best in the series. His movies look great, and he looks great as Bond. He just has such a wonderful physical presence. He knows how to use body language in a way to really own the space he's in. And that works nicely with these very luxurious clothes that he starts to adopt over the course of the series. Even his casual looks are very stylish and elegant. And I really admire all that together in his portrayal, this sort of stylish, almost psychopathic killer who is just kind of barreling his way into a career with a bit of like a death wish driving him, as we see him expressed to M in the start of Casino Royale, this sort of like death drive. It's a very interesting portrayal of the character. It's a subversive portrayal of the character. It's certainly it started subversive and ended radically subversive in a way that not all Bond fans are on board with. I mostly like No Time to Die, for the record, so that also colors my feelings about Craig here. But it's a portrayal of Bond that I enjoy in small doses, and I appreciate the coherence of Daniel Craig's approach to Bond, but it is not my personal favorite. I actually prefer my fifth favorite Bond, Pierce Brosnan, in terms of overall demeanor. I like watching Brosnan a lot. I think Brosnan is a naturally gifted actor who is a true star in the sense that he has just a very easygoing, natural charisma. He is something of the true movie star Bond. He's beautiful to look at. He moves with grace. He speaks with such endearing charm. He really could have been so great. The problem is that I think none of his scripts really play to his strength, which is verbal banter. Brosnan is a very thoughtful actor when it comes to dialogue. He brings a lot of musicality into the way he articulates language, and that makes him particularly gifted with banter. It's a great tragedy that none of his films gave him anything like what Daniel Craig had in Casino Royale with Vesper. This sense of an ongoing relationship that is developed through subsequent scenes of banter would have been exactly what Brosnan would have excelled at. He would have been so good at that. That was what he built his reputation on in the Remington Steele years. But the scripts for the Brosnan era aren't really interested in giving Brosnan that sort of room to play. Brosnan did get that room to play in some of the other movies he did. Take for instance the Thomas Crown Affair, where he has such wonderful banter back and forth with Rene Rousseau throughout that movie. You don't get that equivalent in the Brosnan Bond years, and in that way, he's always kind of forced to play to other, aspects of the character. It's like, this is Brosnan's version of a Roger Moore moment. This is Brosnan's version of a Sean Connery moment. This is Brosnan's version of a Dalton moment. We don't get a lot of this is Brosnan's version of a Brosnan Bond moment. And I think the movies let him down there, because I think if they had really leaned into that, we would have had something really, really special. He's a great actor. I love him to death. He was my generation's Bond in a lot of ways. The first Bond I ever saw was actually Sean Connery in terms of a movie I saw. But Brosnan's Bond was the Bond of my generation. It was his face on posters and in the Nintendo 64 video game that really got me interested in this character. So I have nothing but love for him. I think his movies just let him down a little bit. And finally, that leaves us with George Lazenby. I don't think that's a hugely surprising choice. I think a lot of folks do put George Lazenby in this position. He only had one movie. I think he was still growing into the role. I think Lazenby is actually a better actor than a lot of folks give him credit for. He was finding his way in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but the final scene of On Her Majesty's Secret Service is probably the best acted scene in any Bond movie. And that's including the Dalton Craig, dramatic acting moments. I think the final scene in On Her Majesty's Secret Service just feels so effortlessly genuine. And Lazenby deserves all the credit in the world for that moment. Unfortunately, his Bond just feels a little rickety. I enjoy the sort of playboy energy that George Lazenby brings to the character. It's very different from the sort of slightly gruff, panther-like energy that Connery's Bond had before him. There's a little bit of a lightness and effervescence about Lazenby's Bond that's really interesting. It would have been really interesting to see how his Bond would have continued to develop, whether they would have leaned into that or whether he would have been permitted to lean into some of the more ruthless moments that he gets in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, given that the next movie potentially could have dealt with Bond seeking revenge. But we don't really know. And in that way, George Lazenby's Bond just feels like a little bit of a question mark. He's enjoyable to me in the film he's in. I think he acts some scenes exceptionally well, but in other aspects, he really feels like he was still finding his footing. And it's hard for any actor who's done only one movie to endear themselves in the way that the other Bonds do. So there you have it. That's my ranking of the Bond actors. If you are curious about my thoughts about any one of them, I have videos on all of their movies, so they're available to you on my channel at any time. But let me know how you feel about my ranking. Did it upset you? Are you frustrated? I'm sure I'll hear from you if you are. But also let me know if any of this resonated with you. I'm very curious to hear if any of my particular fixation on Bond's intelligence as a core aspect of the character is something that connects with you. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll catch you in the next one.